Speaking. So welcome to our Sneak Peek program. The title of this new exhibit is Survival of the Fittest, Envisioning Wildlife and Wilderness with the Big Four. And you'll be hearing who the Big Four are if you don't already know. I'm Jane Lavino. I'm the Sugden Chief Curator of Education here at the museum. And this exhibit officially opens tomorrow, but you are getting a sneak peek right now. It opens tomorrow, May 27th, and it's up through August 20th. We are grateful to our exhibit sponsors, some of whom I hope are with us today, I think so. Val and Dick Beck, Lisa Carlin, Marnie and Tasso Coyne, the Freese Wildlife Art Charitable Lead Annuity Trust, Howell A. and Ann M. Breedlove Foundation, Jill and Chesterson Larson, Carol and Jim Linton, the Mays Family Foundation, Bill Newton, Peggy Rose Schneider Endowment Fund, Maggie and Dick Scarlett, Caroline and Ken Taylor, Marcia and Mike Taylor, Thomas and Elizabeth Granger Family Charitable Fund, and the Thomas Gilcrease Foundation. Those are the sponsors of the exhibit. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tammy Hanawalt, who is our Curator of Art, and she will begin today's program by reading the museum's land acknowledgement and then introducing Adam Harris, who is our main speaker. But before that, I'm going to mention to you that you get a special discount in the restaurant if you want to stay for lunch after the program. If you are not a member, tell them you attended the Sneak Peek program and you'll get 10% off on lunch. If you're already a member, don't say that. Use your bigger discount that you get from being a member. So, Tammy, thanks.
Thanks, Jane. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the museum is located on the ancestral land of the Shoshone Bannock and Eastern Shoshone peoples, with many others having historic ties to the region. Please join us in acknowledging these Indigenous communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. The museum is committed to amplifying Native voices and increasing representation in our permanent collection. Now it is my pleasure to introduce to you somebody that I've been working with for a long time, and a lot of you know, Dr. Adam Harris, who is the Granger Kerr Director of the Carl Rungus Catalog Raisonné, and he'll be leading our show today.
All right, thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. So, where to begin? I could begin with saying who the Big Four are, which is Carl Rungus and three of his contemporaries, Richard Friese, Wilhelm Kühnert, and Bruno Lillefors. And so when I started this Catalog Raisonné project with Rungus in 2020 and devised this work plan, like a 9-year work plan to get all this done, and I built 2 exhibits into that overall work plan, and this is one of them. And it was selfishly a way to talk more about the Catalog Raisonné project, which I can do in a minute, but also selfishly, it was a way to bring together artwork from 2 really amazing collections that we had been thinking about bringing together since 2003. So this exhibit is work from here, from the National Museum of Wildlife Art, and from the Rijksmuseum Twente, and I never know exactly how to say that, but Rijksmuseum Twente in Enschede in the Netherlands. But when we say, hey, we've got the show and we borrowed works from the Rijksmuseum, everyone is like, oh, I've been to the Rijksmuseum, it's phenomenal. And you're like, well, not that Rijksmuseum. This is a Rijksmuseum that I bet a couple of you have been to, but not very many. So the main Rijksmuseum, which just means state museum, is in Amsterdam. This Rijksmuseum is in Enschede, which is way over on the border with Germany. But fortunately for us, they have a similar collection of the work of these artists, the Big Four, Kühnert, Lillefors, Rungus, and Friese. And I don't know any other museum in the world that has a collection of work like they do and like we do. So it's joining these 2 collections, bringing the best works by these 4 artists together. And in part they're called the Big Four because if you ask wildlife artists working today who their influences are, one of these artists, if not more, will be on their list of people that they mentioned. Just have had a tremendous impact on the way that we see wildlife, the way that we think about wilderness, and the way that many artists are working today. Let's see. If we were going to go chronologically, we would start in that gallery with Richard Friese, but there seems like there's maybe too many folks to go in there. So take a peek in there, and we will maybe head in to where that folding door is, and talk a little bit more in there.
Sorry.
So if you do go, I encourage you to go see Friese. Friese is a really interesting character in this group in that he was a little bit older than the other artists and was teaching at a school that Kuhnert and Rungus attended, the Berlin Academy of Arts. One of the main themes of this exhibit is these are some of the first artists that got to go to the places where these animals lived and see them in person, in their natural habitat, study natural behavior, etc. So Friese got to go see polar bears, saw moose in his environs in Northern Europe, and a beautiful red deer painting that's in there. So let's breeze through there, but we'll go and since there's something. So as I said, Friese was a bit of a mentor to Kuhnert and Rungus, and I haven't seen much evidence that Lillefors and Friese interacted very much. But so to start off, we talk about Kuhnert. He was the first academically, classically trained artist to go on safari in Africa. He went to Tanzania, which was then German East Africa, 3 times during his life. And he also made a side trip on one of those journeys to Sri Lanka, which was then known as Ceylon. He was able to go, this is one of the topics we talk about, he was able to go to, come on in, to Germany, East Africa, because it was a colony of Germany, and they had really paved the way for other people to come. And so we do note, especially for Kuhnert and Rungus, that their access to these areas wouldn't have been possible if it were not for the colonial policies of the United States and Europe, which were not always really great, and actually were often fairly terrible. So clearing the land of native tribes, clearing the land of lots of the wildlife that we value, etc. So that's definitely something to keep in mind while we look at these paintings. But what we do, we try to balance, the positive. We're not just putting these up so we can talk about how terrible the people were that created them. What they did, and what one of the main themes of this exhibit is that they brought this vision of wildlife and wilderness to a broader audience that maybe hadn't thought about those two things together before. So previous to this, you might have had scientific engravings, which would show a kind of diagrammatic view of an animal without any relationship to its habitat at all. Or you might have had animals illustrating a fable or a story from the Bible, or you might have had a really pretty overt sporting or hunting scene. So there were very few works of art that just showed you the animal in its natural habitat, living its life, doing natural behaviors, etc. So that's what these artists really brought to the table. And they were all hunters, so you can look at this as being hunter's eye view of all these creatures. But if you go beyond that, if you're not a hunter, you can still look at these paintings today and just think about the beauty of these creatures in these natural spaces. So it was this era in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when we really started to not only value the animal, well, we started to value animals and not try to kill them all, value the animal and its natural habitat and try to preserve those things together. So we also talk about the conservation movement and how that began, how art has impacted conservation over the years, and how ideas of conservation have developed since these eras. Okay, so Kuhnert, first European trained artist to traveled to Africa. Tanzania is where he mostly went. Just beautiful pieces all around the room. Again, there's probably 6 paintings from the Rijksmuseum in here and 6 paintings from here. I tried at first to balance these things out so that there'd be half and half, and it just didn't end up working out, and it seemed like a silly idea. So anyway, we ended up borrowing 18 paintings from the Rijksmuseum, and there's 23 paintings from the Wildlife Art Museum in here. Another thing we talk about is the style that each artist painted in. Frieze is much more traditional, as you'll see if you go in there, and Kunert also follows in that school. He did not really embrace Impressionism to a great degree. So if you look around here, these are fairly naturalistically painted, but there are some impressionistic things about his work, which is really fun to see. And one explanation I read of this is that he painted really quickly. So they said he would start at the upper left corner of the canvas and work his way down to the lower right corner, and just this amazing thing would emerge in a pretty rapid fashion. So you can see that in a painting like the elephants, he spent much more time on the elephants and really working the details of that, and kind of quickly did the rest of it. So that's one way to think of it. There are a couple paintings in here that seem to me fairly impressionistic. The lioness and cubs over there is really beautiful, kind of study of light, color, and then that Cape Buffalo painting definitely has some pretty loose kind of impressionistic areas through it. But if there was a Kunert exhibit in 2018, and they came down on the side of him not really embracing Impressionism, but I think there's definitely certain areas where you can see that happen. All right, let's move on here. So this is an interesting exhibit to talk about too, because I made this comparison before. It's not a one-person exhibit where you're just going into the biography of one artist, and it's not a group show where you have little biographies of 20 different artists. Trying to go in depth in the histories and stories of 4 different artists, as we're also trying to bring in these other themes to talk about and think about. So there's a lot of different ways to go, a lot of different things to talk about, and I hope I'll cover some of them in a decent form. So we do have bio panels on each artist. Carrie Schwartz, who was working with the education department and just recently stopped, designed the really cool maps so you can see where the artists went and the animals that they painted in each different region, because it's important for this show that we know where the artists got to travel, the animals that they got to study, etc. So we have those panels, and then we have, like I said before, the info panels, colonialism being one. We have a nice panel on indigenous wildlife art that Tammy worked really hard on, and another panel right there on conservation, which I talked about a second ago. So we want to acknowledge that there were, people in these places where they went, and those people had incorporated wildlife into their work forever. So the indigenous populations, while they're not in any way shown in any of these paintings, is just another great aspect to think about as we are looking at this artwork, to realize that these weren't unpopulated regions, even though they often look like that. There's no trace of human existence, it's just the animal in the wilderness, etc. But that's not reality, that's not actually what was happening. So it's another good thing to keep in mind. But then, on the other hand, much of the value of these paintings is that they are forwarding as legitimate subjects in and of their own right, the animal and the landscape as something really worthy, really worth value. So there's many different sort of tangents and things to talk about. So that room is Kunert, this room is Lillefors and Rungus, the 2 younger artists in the group. No, Lillefors is in the middle. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Let's go back to the style that these artists painted in. These 2 artists, especially Rungus, as many of you probably know, began in a much more academic, kind of realistic style. This is kind of a dark and moody painting of a moose in New Brunswick. And over time, as he spent more time in the wilderness, he developed a much more impressionistic approach, as you can see as you look around the room. And Lillefors also began painting these really small, tiny paintings, very intricately done. And he also, as he grew older, developed a much more impressionistic style. So I really love things like the swan down there, which the swan is very carefully done, and then the whole painting just kind of fades out as you go to the edge of the canvas into really beautiful just brushwork and light. And that was a technique he used, and also in things like this, which is a great painting of maybe one of his trained falcons coming down on a mallard. And all of this stuff right here is really nicely and carefully done. And then look, the speed with which he paints all of this stuff, all of the landscape, really kind of communicates the speed of what's happening in the air. So he used Impressionism really effectively. And he also, as you'll notice, is the only one who really focused on birds and bird life. He concentrated most of his time in Sweden, was fortunate to be able to buy a little island in an archipelago off the coast of Stockholm, and would just spend all these summers on this island studying the bird life, studying sea life, etc. He also had quite a big menagerie of creatures. So he had some birds, I think he might have had a pet fox. So he was a real student of nature, and also, as they all were, but also had these animals kind of as models and pets that he used in his work. Rungus did not have these guys as pets and models, but he did go out and study them very often. Of all of the artists, I think he traveled Lillefors lived among these things for his whole life. Rungus traveled every summer and fall to the Rocky Mountains to study these creatures in person and to hunt them in person. Although he hunted more in the beginning of his career and less at the end of his career. He started off coming to the Wind Rivers here in the early part of his career from 1894 through the early 1900s, and then he started going up to Banff in the Canadian Rockies and built a studio there eventually in 1921. And from that point on, he went to Canadian Rockies every summer and every fall, almost every summer and every fall until the end of his life, which was in 1959. So a really long span of time that he went up there, studied the wildlife, created paintings, etc. So let's see. We tried to do some geography, like that moose represents New Brunswick and Maine, and the place that he painted. Much of these other paintings are Canadian in nature. He also went to the Yukon, which is represented by those doll sheep over there. And there's a Wind River bugler painting, which is the elk, so that represents Wyoming. Let's see, what else can I tell you? Do you have any questions as I go on and on?
When you're talking about the painting being done really fast,
Uh-huh.
how long are you talking about?
I don't know exactly how long I would be talking about, but not. So Rungus, I think, was a little bit slower and a little bit less prolific,
Yeah.
whereas Kunert painted a lot of paintings. So that's about my best way to describe it. But then a lot of Kunert's paintings were lost in World War II. So even though he probably painted more paintings, there are fewer of them in existence today. What else? The exhibit is, go ahead.
Where did the term the Big Four come from?
Okay,
Did somebody?
that's a great question.
It's not a plant, honestly.
If you all know Todd Wilkinson, who has written several things for Called Wild, and is up in Montana, and has been lived in Jackson for a while, and now does all kinds of good nature writing. I thought he termed it, and so I called him up and asked him, did you like come up with that phrase, the big four, for these artists? And he said, no, I thought you did. So I'm like, I don't know where it came from. It just seems like something that we've used since I, started here in 2000 as a way to describe these artists. Maybe Tucker knows.
It's not a coincidence that they all lived at the same time.
Yeah. So, but yeah, who came up with that term? It comes from a hunting term, the Big Five, which is in Africa, the animals that you would go over and hunt. All these guys have hunting connections. But we can't quite figure that out. I tried to Google it and see if I could come up with who might have first used that phrase, but don't know.
Can we give it to you, Adam?
No, I don't want to claim it if I We can give it to Bill Kerr, how about that? We'll see. Came up with it.
How long will this exhibit be shown?
So this will be up through August 20th here, and then it's going to 5 other museums in the States. It's going to the Sporting Art Library in Virginia. There's a new Wildlife and Western Art Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida, the James. It's going to a Western Art Museum in San Antonio called the Briscoe. It's going to Leoch Woodson Art Museum in Wausau, Wisconsin, and then it's going to the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. So that's going to be a big, fun venue for it to be at. And I should mention, when we first started talking about this exhibit, back in 2003 when I went to the Rijksmuseum to see this collection, Leoch Woodson was really interested in participating in this venture, and so I'm so happy that they retained that interest over the course of the last 20 years. You may know them, they do Birds in Art every year. A bunch of artists from here participate in that. So yeah, it's got a nice tour that's happening with it. There will be a catalog that's coming out in late June that accompanies the exhibit. It has essays by 2 scholars interested in this topic, not from here, an essay by Tammy, one by me, an interview with Bill Kerr and Sue Simpson Gallagher, who's the museum's first curator, and then a little piece about the development of the collection in Enschede written by their now former curator. And then of course reproductions of all the paintings and bios of the artist, etc.
Yeah. Is Paul coming over at any point?
I haven't heard if he is,
No.
so I don't know. It'd be nice if he did. Paul Canoli is the curator at the Rijksmuseum, who's been a real champion of this collection of theirs forever. And it's one of those things, like, it just doesn't get out of the storage very often in Enschede. So it's really nice to be able to have these here. It was a funny coincidence. We were right in the middle of trying to figure out what paintings to borrow and which ones they'd let us have. And a museum in Sweden was mounting a Lillefors exhibit, so they started requesting all the Lillefors paintings that we wanted. So we had a little bit of a negotiation about that, but we ended up with almost every single Lillefors painting that I wanted.
Was there anything extraordinary that you had to deal with, Adam, in terms of bringing the work from home?
No, but I didn't believe it was actually going to happen until the paintings arrived here, 2 weeks ago. It was more complicated to deal with borrowing from a foreign museum, and there was a little bit of a language barrier, although they speak really good English. It was and I would have liked it if we had had this whole thing set up a year ago, but it took a really long time to get everything in place. And so finally, by the last 2 months, everything fell into place and it all arrived. So it's all here. It'll stay here for the next 2 years as it goes around the country, and then it'll go back. So,
Congrats.
yeah.
Question, I arrived late, so I didn't know whether these were actually scenes that they painted in the outdoors, or were they photographs, based on photographs?
So they would have used photographs, field studies, sketches of animals that they drew out in the field, probably sketches of animals that they had in their homes or in zoos or whatever. So when they got in the studio, they had all this material around them
I got it.
to work from, and then they created these, which are original works of art. They're not documents of I went out and saw that sea eagle attacking that eider duck. So if we think of them as documentary pieces, I don't think that's giving them enough credit.
Right.
One thing I was going to say about Cooner is that I think we figured out, and this is backed up by his granddaughter, or great-granddaughter, who has all of his diaries and archival materials, that he really didn't spend very much time in India. He spent time in Sri Lanka, but tigers are not native to Sri Lanka. So he might not have ever seen a tiger in the wild, even though his paintings of tigers are some of the best things that he ever did. So, and this goes back to what I was saying, these artists had the abilities and the skills to take all their field experience and all of those studies that they'd done and
Compost.
take that knowledge back to the studio and compose a great work of art. So you shouldn't think of it, as that's an exact thing that they saw out in the wilderness, but they saw this type of thing, and they're trying to present to us how these animals live out in nature, not necessarily with us being present.
We have 3 artists right here who are well known in our community and paint wildlife. I'd be curious as to what their reaction is and their thoughts as they're looking at this collection today. If they'd be willing to.
I think this is wonderful. This is the reason for this museum, for shows like this.
This is an
Congratulations.
important part of the history of this whole subject, for sure. And it's amazing to be able to bring all these together. Dwayne, any thoughts?
I just congratulate you. I mean, the Big Four, as they're called, from my perspective as an artistic opinion, I mean, you look at their contemporaries and how incredibly gifted they were. And they brought all that great training, internal passion to focus on wildlife and landscape. And, you look at Friese, his affiliation with Eugene Brock in Germany, great landscape painter. They obviously compared notes like the National Academicians did in Rungus's era. I just find it inspiring. I'll be back. Thanks, Ed.
Sure.
Congratulations, what a feat. Just thinking of the boat ride that these paintings took to get here, and the insurance to keep them insured, it's fantastic. But I like to, as I come in here and look at these masterworks of all 4, the rest of the museum, I'm a huge history fan, kind of first-person history, and this is as close as I can get to figuring out what they were thinking when they were creating these. And then to step back and see the compositional things that they did to draw you into the center of interest. It's very educational for artists to analyze these without the words in your head. You have to kind of put them in the scene. Very valuable.
Was it a big challenge in terms of insurance and travel?
So, well, whatever. It was hugely expensive to ship 18 paintings of this size, like some big paintings from the Netherlands to here. Like huge crates, cargo plane, semi-trucks, all that stuff. Lots of people involved every single step of the way. So it was a big endeavor. No, it's really nice that they're here and that we have the sponsorship to do it, and that it's going on tour, because then that helps, underwrite some of the costs, etc. I'm really pleased that it's all coming together.
No, the staff did a great job.
Yeah, thanks to everybody here, for all their hard work.
Great.